Hi, my name is Seth Bushinsky. I am an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I was asked today to talk about how float pH and derived carbon products have been used to help understand the carbon cycle. And so today, most of the questions that I'm going to be talking about revolve around understanding air-sea fluxes of carbon dioxide and the seasonal cycles that drive those. So this is a map from Takahashi et al. 2009. These large, pretty pictures of air-sea CO2 fluxes are familiar to most of us. And these are ultimately derived from data, but it's useful considering what data go into them. And just to sort of set us up, the contemporary global air-sea flux based on maps like these is around 2.5 petagrams of carbon per year. And the Southern Ocean fraction of that, I'll be talking a lot about the Southern Ocean today, in part because that's where a lot of the new float measurements are, is around 1.1 petagrams of carbon per year that's taken up by the ocean. Now, underlying these really detailed maps, we have an awful lot of surface FCO2 observations. So these are compiled in the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas, SOCAT, which is a huge amount of work, and we are very much indebted to the people who both make these measurements and collate them into the SOCAT databases that we all use and rely on. Now, this plot from Bakker et al. 2013 shows the number of unique monthly observations in the upper figure and the number of monthly observations in the lower. And this gives you a sense of both the data distribution and density in terms of the seasonal sampling. So in the upper figure, we see a lot of observations in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly a lot more than in the Southern Hemisphere. And places where we get full seasonal cycles are colored in the reds and light reds here. Places where we only have a couple months out of the full annual cycle sampled are these purples here. So the Southern Hemisphere is really fairly deficient in some areas, and we have big open ocean areas elsewhere as well. Now, if you look at the seasonal distribution of measurements, this is just looking at one decade, the 2000s. This is from a later paper by Bakker et al. We can see in, say, winter months, the Northern Hemisphere has fewer wintertime measurements than they do in the summer. In, say, April through June or July through September. But really the Southern Hemisphere in the austral winter is fairly sparse. And so floats provide an opportunity to address some of the places where ships don't go and give us a lot of information about the seasonal cycle and about these open ocean areas where we are somewhat limited. So this is a map showing global biogeochemical float distributions. It's not 100% up to date. For instance, there are the GO-BGC floats are deployed in the Atlantic aren't shown here, but this gives you a general idea of the density of observations. So oxygen floats are in blue, nitrate floats are in red, and pH floats are in green. Floats that have pH also have oxygen and nitrate, and floats that have nitrate almost always also have oxygen as well. You can see there's this large high density region in the Southern Ocean, and that is primarily due to the Southern Ocean Carbon Climate Observations and Modeling Project, or SOCOM. Now, SOCOM, most of you are familiar with, or if you aren't, there will be other talks that will do a better job of giving you the rundown, but essentially, goal of SOCOM was to put out floats and use floats and models to try and understand the carbon cycle in the Southern Ocean, which is hugely important to the overall global carbon uptake. As I showed earlier, it's about 40% of the total. So this is a comparison of what the floats get us relative to what we already have from shipboard observations, or what we are getting from shipboard observations. This is from a paper I published a few years ago, where we were looking at air-sea CO2 fluxes, and I'll talk more about that later. But the point of this is that when we look, similar to the Bakker et al. Paper, at the number of months represented, in the Southern Ocean from ships and from floats, we see pretty different distributions over this 4-year time period. So ships, there's a lot of places where we have some measurements, but only really 3 areas where we have a full annual cycle sampled during this time period. Floats, we don't have quite the same data coverage everywhere, but we have a lot more open ocean areas that are these darker reds, indicating that we have more of a seasonal cycle sample. And so the floats are starting to really fill in some of the gaps in our current understanding. So now I mentioned that the floats measure pH. That doesn't get us the full carbonate system. So in order to get PCO2 or DIC, we need 2 carbonate system parameters. And so the float measures pH, and we get alkalinity from an estimate. The estimates that I typically use, and I think most of the ones that I'm showing here, use the Lyre or Lyre V2 algorithms from Brendan Carter. Those are multiple linear regressions that estimate alkalinity using other float measured parameters. And so using measured pH and estimated alkalinity, we can calculate either the fugacity of CO2 or DIC. Now, these are not as accurate as actual measurements. So theoretical accuracy from Nancy Williams' work for PCO2 is around plus or minus 2.9%, or around 11 microatmospheres, assuming near atmospheric PCO2, and a DIC of around plus or minus 6 micromoles per kilometer. For reference, shipboard measurements, good shipboard measurements, are on the order of 2 to 3 microatmospheres of uncertainty. So what are we going to look at today? So first, this is a rundown of the sort of 4 areas that I'm going to focus on. One is just, do float PCO2 estimates agree with underway PCO2 measurements? That is something that we continue to have to look at, because the PCO2 that we get from floats is not a measurement. And so it's important to continue to validate it and not just trust it blindly. I'll show some examples of the use of surface data for CO2 fluxes. I'll show a few papers that looked at seasonal cycles of DIC, both at the surface and subsurface, and what that tells us about the carbon cycle. And then I'll talk a little bit about considerations when using this data and future work that we might hope to see. So first, do the SOCOM PCO2 estimates and SOCAT measurements agree? So this is a paper from Amanda Fay and co-authors, where they looked at Drake Passage time series CO2 to look at variability in the Southern Ocean PCO2. I just took one set of figures from here that was assessing how well the SOCOM PCO2 was doing in the early days. This was published in 2018, so only a few years of data. And so they compared float PCO2 as the floats were passing through the Drake Passage to the Drake Passage time series, the underway PCO2 measurements on the ships going through the Drake Passage. And so this is a seasonal cycle shown in these colored lines here, with the floats are orange. The Drake Passage time series for a few different time periods is shown in black and purple. And to a first order, these agree quite well, albeit with a lot more uncertainty on the floats. This study agreed with some earlier work published by Nancy Williams and some later work published by Alison Gray that found that the float PCO2 estimates might be high, on the order around 3 to 4 microatmospheres. So I have updated some of these crossover comparisons. This is using SOCAT v2020, so not updated with the most recent version that came out, I think, a week ago, but still with quite a bit more data than those early studies. And when I look at crossovers, so any float PCO2 that's within plus or minus 1 day and plus or minus 25 kilometers of SOCAT PCO2 underway measurements, I get, this is the one-to-one plot here shown on the left, colored by days since first deployment. the floats, just to illustrate that we really only have data from the deployments. We don't have too many long-term measurements. When you look at the histograms on the right, our mean is about 3.7. So floats high of shipboard underway PCO2, but again, around 3.5 microatmospheres. And so that's consistent with earlier work. Now, if I include a density filter and remove any data outside of a 0.03 kilogram per meter cubed threshold, then this mean drops down to around 1 microatmosphere. So very small and maybe even a little bit better than had been previously found, but still with a huge range. So there's a large standard deviation on these crossovers, in part because it's just it's difficult to compare float and shipboard data. Things change relatively quickly, and they're not always sampling the exact same parcel of water. But overall, we don't see evidence for the sort of systematic bias that would really be concerning in what really might impact some of our large-scale air-sea CO2 flux estimates. So I'm going to show some work looking at the Southern Ocean carbon cycle, specifically the air-sea CO2 flux. And so it's, I think, worthwhile to just sort of refresh in our minds what this means, what this represents. So our contemporary flux is a mix of anthropogenic and natural fluxes. So this nice figure from Gruber et al. 2019 shows anthropogenic CO2 on the left and natural CO2 on the right. And overall, the picture that we have in the Southern Ocean is this anthropogenic increase in atmospheric PCO2 is forcing anthropogenic carbon into the ocean. And that's overlaid on a natural CO2 cycle that is roughly balanced between uptake in the north as these waters move south. You have biological production and cooling, so they can take up CO2. And that is balancing this upwelled CO2 that is causing outgassing as these deep waters that are enriched in organic or degraded organic matter, so they're enriched in carbon, come up to the surface, they warm, outgas that natural carbon to the surface, or to the atmosphere. And so our approximate balance is a contemporary flux of about 1 petagram of carbon into the ocean is really just an anthropogenic signal overlaid on a balanced natural cycle. And overall, we have more confidence in this anthropogenic value that comes from interior ocean carbon measurements. And so in 2018, Allison Gray published this paper that has had a lot of influence in the field, looking at what float PCO2 estimates told us about Southern Ocean CO2 fluxes. And so this figure here, I'll break it down, but this is the CO2 flux on the y-axis, and then each of these different vertical regions are different zones in the Southern Ocean. So going from the north in the subtropical zone, then we have the subantarctic zone, the polar frontal zone, the Antarctic southern zone, and the seasonal ice zone. And the colored bars here are float estimates. These are the annual means, followed by the summer mean, which is just the white bar outlined in the color, and then the hashed bars are the winter means. And so for each zone, there's the flux based on Takahashi 2009. There's a flux based on the global carbon budget in 2017, and then the float fluxes. And so the really significant difference that jumps out is this Antarctic southern zone, where the floats indicate strong outgassing. That's primarily due to this very strong wintertime outgassing. That's really not seen in the Takahashi or global carbon budget data sets. Now this extended some earlier work by Nancy Williams in 2017 from looking at a few individual floats when she was first describing how to calculate PCO2 from float pH and alkalinity MLRs. And this is showing float 9096, which we'll see again a bit later, that had this very high delta PCO2 in the wintertime that was significantly above the earlier Takahashi estimates or Landshutzer neural network estimates. So overall, this is very interesting, and it's in large part interesting because it disagrees with the prior ship-based work that is using much more accurate measurements, but measurements that are also biased towards summertime observations. So a bit of a conundrum there. And just to show how the seasonal cycle looks in these different zones, again, this is the Antarctic Southern Zone, and so this seasonal cycle here is really where we have, or the winter time in the Antarctic Southern Zone is really where we have biggest disagreements, though there are some differences in the sub-Antarctic zone, the polar frontal zone as well. Overall, good agreement in the subtropical zone. So one of the things that we wanted to do after that initial study was to combine float and ship data to look at whether we could reconcile the two and whether we could provide estimates based on both float and ship data to combine the high accuracy data from the ships with the seasonal cycle that we get from the floats. And so I and a number of co-authors worked on incorporating the float and the ship data using two methods. So the Landshutzer et al. Neural network and the Rodenbeck et al. Ionic-Carboscope mixed layer interpolation scheme. So these are two of the methods that are used by the Global Carbon Budget and widely used in the community that try to take properties that we can measure or estimate globally and fill in spatial and temporal gaps in our PCO2 observations to then calculate ARC fluxes globally, or here we're just looking at the Southern Ocean. And then we tested three different PCO2 products. So one is ship only. This is the sort of standard data set that they use. One is combined ship and float estimate, where we averaged ship and float data in grid cells where we had both of them, and one that was float weighted. So this was to try and give a sensitivity test of if we push things towards the float data, what fluxes would we come up with? And so we did a lot of different analyses, but just to cut to the chase, when we added in float data, both for the neural network and for the mixed layer interpolation scheme, we increased outgassing in the same regions that Alison Gray saw in her paper. So the polar frontal zone and the Antarctic Southern Zone, we had significant outgassing primarily in the winter time. A bit more of a response in the Ionic-Carboscope mixed layer interpolation scheme than in the neural network, but increased outgassing in both. And this was, as I said, consistent with the Gray study, though we had differences in the magnitude. And so to sort of just show the final results from that study, we found that our best guess for the Southern Ocean CO2 flux was minus 0.75 petagrams of carbon per year. So not the 0.1 petagrams of carbon per year uptake found in the Gray et al. 2018 paper, but still a significant reduction of about 0.4 petagrams of carbon per year from the sort of ship-only baseline. And so if we go back to our budget for the Southern Ocean carbon cycle, our calculation of a contemporary flux of 0.75 petagrams of carbon per year and our sort of continued anthropogenic uptake of minus 1.1 gives us a natural carbon outgassing of 0.4 petagrams of carbon per year. And that's consistent with some other work that has showed that there is likely a natural carbon outgassing in the Southern Ocean, potentially from river inputs. But this is something that is really ongoing and has been tested and compared with from a variety of studies using different methods. So Sutton et al. 2021 made some comparisons with sail drone data from transit around Antarctica. McKay et al. 2021 compared the outgassing that we found with some synthetic profiles that they created using shipboard data in a really nice and interesting study. So there's a lot that has come out, and there's a lot more that will come out as we try and pick apart this story. Now, looking beyond air-sea CO2 fluxes, so if we look at this nice cross-section diagram from Morrison et al. 2015, Southern Ocean is a really complicated place. We've been looking at these sort of bulk air-sea CO2 fluxes, but there's a lot of stuff going on. So this is just illustrating some of the different water masses. So you've got upwelling of deep water masses around the ACC, shown here, the polar front, the subantarctic front, subtropical fronts, bottom water formation, you have mode and intermediate water formation. There's a lot of physical and biological processes that go into these air-sea CO2 fluxes, and that have lots of other interesting stories unrelated to the air-sea CO2 flux. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the other work that has looked at surface and processes at depth. Keeping in mind, I'm only looking at studies that directly use the pH and derived carbon products from the floats. So there's a whole host of other work looking at biogeochemical cycles in the Southern Ocean. I know Leonel Arteaga is talking about some of the work from oxygen and other sensors. There will be a lot of useful videos posted on the GO-BGC website. So this is by no means a comprehensive look at biogeochemistry or the carbon cycle, just only looking at ones associated with pH or derived products. So looking at seasonal DIC dynamics from float data, Nancy Williams published a study in 2018 that was looking at surface dynamics. So trying to understand what drives seasonal cycles in DIC from float data. So this is again looking at float 9096 in the Antarctic Southern Zone, in the Atlantic, I believe. And this is a seasonal cycle of DIC on the top, the black line showing the total DIC, and total alkalinity on the bottom. And main takeaway from here is that this blue teal line, this is net community metabolism. And we see really large increase in DIC due to that each winter. And what this essentially is just the upwelling of waters that are enriched in carbon from the degradation of organic matter. These are old waters, and they're rich in carbon. And so that it has a biological source, but is really the upwelling of these waters. And this high DIC water is what is driving those air-sea CO2 fluxes. And you can see this here where she looks at the influence on PCO2 of these different components, and this really large wintertime increase in PCO2 is from this net community metabolism, which again is that upwelling signal. So this makes a lot of sense with what is seen from the air-sea CO2 fluxes. Now, in another interesting study moving further south, so before Nancy's study was looking, well, Nancy's study looked at the whole Southern Ocean. I showed you data just from the Antarctic Southern Zone. This is a paper from Ellen Briggs, also in 2018. I'm looking at how physical and biological drivers of biogeochemical tracers influence the seasonal cycle within the seasonal sea ice zone. So this is just showing data from one float again, this float 590-4184, where she's showing this is an under ice period. So ice cover is in this blue line at the top here, oxygen saturation, upper left, pH, DIC, bottom left, and chlorophyll A, bottom right. And so it's really nice look at what is happening under the sea ice, something that we've had very few observations from historically. And so these nice sections on the left are distilled into a oxygen flux on the right here in the top, and DIC flux on the bottom. And so in this under ice period, we have a drawdown of oxygen, so reduction in the excuse me, this isn't the flux, this is the column inventory. So reduction in oxygen and an increase in DIC. from the respiration of organic matter during this under ice period. And then as soon as the ice retreats, you get this really large increase in chlorophyll and production. Excuse me. This is the problem with having a toddler. You get sick very often. So I apologize for any hoarseness. Anyway, so a reduction in DIC and increase in oxygen as you have the productive time period. So a really nice and interesting first look into what is going on underneath sea ice in the water column. So those were just a few highlights of studies that we have where we've seen the direct use of pH and derived carbon products from the floats, and really just a preview of work that is to come. I guess I want to talk a little bit about things to keep in mind, both in terms of uncertainties and also in terms of potential for these data. So one, just I guess something that I keep in mind is that these are estimates and they will change as we understand the pH sensors better, as we understand the corrections better. And so I would not take any float PCO2 as gospel for now, or maybe ever. But they add a lot of really interesting information. And so that's what we're trying to use. And so this flow chart here is from Williams et al. 2017, where Nancy Williams did a really careful analysis of all the different uncertainties that go into the PCO2 estimates from the floats. So starting with float pH and total alkalinity, really tracing all the different possibilities for uncertainty. And there's a lot here that we don't understand as well as we should. There's an OCV working group that's looking at possible issues with pH and how it's adjusted. There's lots of ongoing research. I'll throw in a few citations of that later. But this is something where it's important to stay up to date with the literature and talk to people and find out what people are working on and what is going on, because it is, as far as we can tell, there are no systematic biases in PCO2. And as I said, it's important to keep checking that. But that's not to say, it's not the same thing as saying that we know that these estimates are so good that you can trust them without considering the source. So that is just my sort of word of caution in using these data, that it's always worth double checking that what is going on really makes sense. Now, in thinking about sort of future work, so this is a diagram that we published a few years ago in a sort of mini review of how autonomous vehicles are measuring the carbonate chemistry in the ocean. So this is work with Yuri Takashita and Nancy Williams. This diagram, I'm sure you've seen others like it. There's time on the y-axis, space on the x-axis, and then these colored blobs represent different processes that we're interested in regards to the carbonate system. And these red squares represent so-called conventional observation platforms, or at least non-autonomous observation platforms. And so, for example, decadal hydrographic surveys are really good at these large scales and sort of decadal time scale of change. And so looking at things like ocean acidification and air CO2 exchange, that's where we've gotten a lot of our information from. Those are less good if you want to look at smaller scale or higher frequency processes, like along the coast, or mesoscale processes, or sub-mesoscale or local biological processes. Now, when we add on autonomous vehicles, looking just at profiling floats here, and this box here, this is where floats really add value. And so we can look at just sort of the expanded coverage from floats, these hashed signs here within this black box. And floats really add a lot finer resolution. So we're more able to have a glimpse into processes and changes on these smaller scales as we expand float coverage. So in the Southern Ocean, we can start looking at regional differences. Globally, we're not there yet, but GO-BGC will get us there. And looking really at time frequencies down into the months time period. For some floats that profile more frequently, you can get even finer timescales, but for most of the GO-BGC floats and most of the global floats within the Argo program, months is about the lowest spatial scale or temporal scale we'll get. And then spatially, they also will help us get a better understanding of these global processes too, as we have observations spread out through time. So there's a lot of exciting things that we can get. And I should mention too, this only shows time and space. We also have depth, and we are getting a lot of really interesting information about water masses, and hopefully we'll get more information about how water masses are changing and what role they play in the carbon cycle as we expand our float observations. So just to wrap up and put things sort of in context, this is going back to that Morrison-All diagram. So I talked about air-sea CO2 fluxes and some work that we've done looking at the large-scale air-sea CO2 fluxes in the Southern Ocean. So also showed some work in seasonal cycles. A number of papers by Nancy Williams, Alison Gray, Ellen Briggs, Amanda Fay, all looking at seasonal cycles of derived carbon products. I didn't have a chance to talk about this Rosso et al. 2020 study, but Issa Rosso published a paper categorizing different zones using the machine learning method, but also looking at how the Kerguelen Plateau influenced biogeochemistry. So really starting to get into the interesting question of how biogeochemistry responds to physics. And I think we're going to see an awful lot more about the sort of interior ocean processes and dynamics over future years and really months. If you saw any of the SOCOM annual meeting talks, there's a lot of work that is going on here, a lot of really exciting stuff coming out. I only focused on published work for this talk, but I think we're going to see a lot of great stuff in the next few years. And then there's, beyond floats. I know this is GO-BGC, so I should focus on floats, but beyond floats, gliders. Yui Takashita has a nice as pH on gliders, and so that's going to really transform what we see from the coasts. Adrian Sutton and others have been putting PCO2 on surface vehicles, sail drones, and that's also going to transform how we're able to observe the ocean. So put all this together and we're going to have an awful lot of really interesting data coming out. So with that, I want to acknowledge the folks who fund all of this work. So NSF, NASA, and NOAA all have funded different parts of SOCOM, GO-BGC, and the Argo program, NSF being the primary sponsor for GO-BGC. Again, as I mentioned, SOCAT is just invaluable to this. None of this work really can exist without the backbone of the shipboard measurements. So there's no world in which the floats can replace shipboard observations, but they hopefully can add good value and supplement what is going on already. SOCOM deployed all of the floats, just about all the floats that I showed today. And I also want to mention, I didn't talk any about the specifics of how you measure pH or correct or validate pH with PCO2, mostly because there are other talks that are doing that, but there is an awful lot of really important work that's gone into that. Basically, to get to any of the derived products, there's just been years and years of work by people. So this is the product of a lot of work. So if you want to read about that, here's some places to get started. And with that, thanks for listening, and I look forward to talking with you all during the meeting.